A DC-9 crew lost in the fog at Detroit Airport.
What runway is this?
Ends up on the wrong end of an active runway.
Throttle drop or down!
The horrifying collision kills 8 people.
A tragic event occurred, but that's just really the tip of the iceberg here.
When investigators dig into the crew's background,
Power controller said, "You were on fire, eject." Bam! Wow.
He was a little brash, a little cocky.
they are shocked by what they uncover.
He's clearly embellishing.
Does the sequence of events leading up to the crash start with the relationship between the pilots?
You say you're on 21 Center?
We're not sure.
Yes, we are.
Exit that runway.
Immediately, sir.
Detroit Metropolitan Airport.
Parking brake.
Set.
The crew of Northwest Airlines Flight 299 prepares to depart for Memphis.
Throttle.
Idle.
Captain Bob Ouellette, First Officer Bill Hagedorn, and their flight engineer have been delayed for more than an hour by a last-minute change of aircraft.
Fasten seatbelts is on. Checklist complete.
They're finally getting underway.
Northwest 299 was a nonstop flight to Memphis, about a 2-hour flight. One of your bread and butter routes for Northwest Airlines at that time.
Detroit's airport is one of the biggest in the U.S., servicing millions of passengers every year. It's also the hub of the nation's 4th largest airline, Northwest.
I would describe Wayne County as a pretty busy airport.
Man, I don't think I've ever seen fog this bad.
In the tower, controllers are dealing with fog that's blanketed the entire airport. It's so thick they can't see the planes they're guiding.
The only way they could know where the aircraft were on the airport was to have the pilots give them positions as to where they were.
Northwest 299, ready to taxi.
Northwest 299, Metro Ground, taxi to runway 3 center via Oscar 6, Fox, and X-ray.
Oscar 6, Fox, X-ray, going to 3 center, Northwest 299.
The ground controller clears Flight 299 to taxi to the active runway 3 center. It will follow a series of taxiways, known as Oscar, Foxtrot, and X-ray, that will take it to the runway's threshold.
The whole purpose of taxiways is to provide movement for aircraft, kind of like highways, to and from the runways themselves, basically roadways for aircraft to move around on an airport.
Northwest 299, what's your position now?
Okay, we just turned down onto X-ray 299.
Roger, switch to tower control 118.4.
Roger.
As Flight 299 nears the runway threshold, control of the plane passes from the ground controller to the tower controller. The 727 is now at the runway threshold, preparing for takeoff.
All set to go back there?
Yes, sir. Ready to go.
Okay.
Tell them we're ready to go.
Tower Northwest 299 is ready on the center.
As an aircraft is ready for departure, they will call the tower. I'll say, we're at the end of the runway, we're ready.
Northwest 299, Metro Tower. Runway 3 center, clear for takeoff.
Roger.
Flight 299 is cleared for takeoff. The 727 is seconds away from leaving the ground.
80 knots.
When a flight crew is in departure mode, dancing the throttles, speed is increasing.
But danger lies ahead. A DC-9 is stopped halfway down the runway. It's carrying 40 passengers. In the cockpit, Captain Bill Lovelace and First Officer Jim Shiffens are lost in the fog.
This is a runway.
Yeah.
Oh, no. Oh, damn!
There's very little time to avoid a collision.
The pilot turned to the left. Maybe he was actually trying to lift that right wing up over that DC-9.
Auto drop!
Inside the DC-9, it's chaos. John Izo, one of the flight's 40 passengers, has no idea what's happened.
There was an explosion, and all I thought was the engine blew up.
He's in shock and unsure what to do.
I sat there for a second, I was kind of dazed. And all of a sudden I hear click, click, click. I said, oh yeah, I guess I better get out of here.
He's stunned by what he sees.
I saw a light, thin light between the fuselage, like it was sliced. I looked back, and I saw fire coming in the back of the plane, like a blowtorch. Coming up, I said, I can't stay here.
Northwest 299 at boarding. There's an aircraft on the runway, and we struck his right wing.
Incredibly, damage to the other plane is limited to the wing. And none of the passengers or crew are injured.
The 727 was virtually intact, except for a pretty good chunk of one wing.
It's a different story on board the DC-9. John Izo realizes to his horror that the passenger opposite him did not survive the accident. Everyone sitting in window seats on that side of the plane is severely injured or dead.
Went to the emergency wing exit, and I was just starting to dismantle it, and a person jumps in front of me, and he's flailing around there and says, hey, easy, easy. So I took it out, I threw the door on the wing. I said, go ahead, buddy. And he went out, starts walking down the wing.
In the tower, controllers are trying to get help to the two damaged airplanes.
Northwest 299, copy. Emergency vehicles are on the runway.
Northwest 299, roger.
When you hear about something like this, your heart goes out for the folks that are involved, not only the passengers on the aircraft and their families, but also the air traffic facility that was involved. It's devastating for them.
John Izo has escaped the burning plane through the emergency wing exit.
All right, come on, let's go, let's go.
Now he's helping others get away.
I'm on the ground, and I saw a gentleman that must either jumped or pushed. And you could tell he broke his leg. So I went over and I got him, moved him away from the plane.
As the inferno rages on, firefighters and emergency response teams race to the scene. But the heavy fog makes their job much harder.
The aircraft was virtually burned out. The passenger compartment was gutted. We knew we were going to lose a lot of evidence because of the fire.
The accident site is a scene of complete devastation.
Good evening. It was a nasty day at the Detroit airport. Rain and fog and confusion. Confusion that ended with a collision and death. Two Northwest airliners trying to take off clipped each other.
John Izo survives, but 8 other passengers are killed, making it the deadliest incident of its kind on U.S. soil in almost 2 decades. A collision on a runway is known as a runway incursion, since one of the planes is clearly not where it should be.
Runway incursions are a particularly difficult problem. And the reason is that aircraft on runways are traveling at such high rates of speed. If the aircraft come into contact there's going to be many fatalities.
The U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, opens an investigation into the accident.
727's wing sliced right through the fuselage.
Bob Benson will lead the investigation.
We obviously knew what happened in a gross sense. 2 aircraft came together and a tragic event occurred.
For Benson, the incident is an eerie reminder of an investigation from 13 years earlier. It was the worst accident in aviation history. March 1977. 2 Boeing 747 jumbo jets collided on the resort island of Tenerife. The crash occurred when a KLM jet initiated its takeoff run, while a Pan Am jet, caught in thick fog, was taxiing on the same runway. $583 people were killed.
The accident at Tenerife affected everybody in aviation. It's always in the back of your mind that this could happen, that an airplane could inadvertently take off on a runway that's not clear.
Since fog was a significant factor in the Tenerife disaster, investigators need to find out what role the weather played in the Detroit accident. Operations investigator Richard Rodriguez joins the investigation.
From the Weather Service reports, the visibility was a big problem at Detroit on this morning.
Visibility was 3/4 of a mile an hour before the accident, but then it drops to a 1/4 mile.
1/4 mile is the minimum.
We did understand that it was very, very foggy out there. So our job was to try to figure out the overall condition of the weather at the airport, and then most specifically at the departure end of the takeoff runway.
He learns that in the minutes before the collision, visibility dropped to the minimum level allowed at the airport.
Everybody agreed that the visibility was at least 1/4 mile. And that would allow operations to continue. Before the accident, every other aircraft that took off had no problem at all finding the end of the proper runway and departing. But our men in the DC-9 didn't do this.
Investigators need to find out exactly how the DC-9 ended up in the path of an oncoming 727. Did air traffic control lead them astray?
We're hoping to find out from the controllers what they are thinking as they issue instructions to the crew.
I cleared them to use Oscar 6, Foxtrot, and X-ray to runway 3 center.
The ground controller gave Captain Lovelace and First Officer Schiffens specific instructions on how to get to the runway.
Northwest 1482, taxi to Oscar 6 to Foxtrot, report making the right turn on X-ray.
Oscar 6 to Foxtrot, report X-ray.
They learned that the DC-9 and the 727 were both supposed to follow the same route.
It seemed to be going smoothly at first. Northwest 1482, what's your position now?
But when asked for an update from the DC-9's crew,
we're headed eastbound on Oscar 6 here.
Eastbound on Oscar 6.
their position report didn't make any sense.
They announced that they were eastbound on Oscar 6, which was an impossibility. It's a northwest-southeast oriented taxiway.
You can tell by the comments that were made by the crew that they had no idea where they were.
Okay, I think we might have missed Oscar 6. See a sign here that says the arrow's to Oscar 5.
The folks in the tower realized that the pilots in the DC-9 were probably becoming a little confused about where they were.
Instead of going straight down Oscar 6, the aircraft turned left and approached taxiway Oscar 5.
The controller pinned down their location to be on the outer taxiway at Oscar 5.
I realized they had made a wrong turn, so I gave them directions to get them back on track. Northwest 1482 at Oscar 4. Make the right turn onto X-ray, report crossing 927.
The DC-9 was then directed to continue straight to Oscar 4, turn right onto X-ray, cross inactive runway 927, and then follow X-ray back to the runway for takeoff.
Roger, at Oscar 4, make the right turn onto X-ray.
The DC-9 radioed back, okay, I understand, or something to that effect. And everybody calmed down and thought that they had straightened everything out.
But somehow, 5 minutes later, Flight 1482 ended up right in the middle of the active runway.
An airplane to be on an active runway when they shouldn't. Somebody did something wrong.
Investigators need to know what happened in those 5 minutes. They interview the crew, starting with Captain Bill Lovelace.
The captain was kind of a mild-mannered fellow. He loved to fly.
We hoped we would find out, why did you miss all this and wind up on an active runway?
I wasn't familiar with the layout of the taxiways and runways.
They learn he was new to the airport in Detroit.
So I asked my first officer, where have you been flying out of? Where have you been flying out of?
Memphis and Detroit.
Good. You can help me find my way around these taxiways here in Detroit.
I sure can.
I thought, great. Someone in the co-pilot seat who knows where he's going. But we still got lost somehow.
The first officer had bragged about his knowledge of the airport. That would have enhanced the likelihood that the captain would have trusted the first officer to help navigate in Detroit.
So why wasn't the first officer able to guide the DC-9 across Detroit Airport? The investigators hope Jim Chiffons, the first officer on the DC-9, can give them the answer.
He was a little brash, perhaps a little cocky. I wouldn't say a know-it-all, but he'd been around the horn.
Captain Lovelace misunderstood. What I meant was, I knew the procedures for pushing back from the gate, not the physical layout of the airport.
They learned the first officer was also inexperienced with the taxiways at Detroit.
It's hard to look at what the first officer did, feigning confidence about his knowledge that was clearly unsupported when he himself wasn't sure.
Investigators conclude the first officer misled the captain, intentionally or not, about his knowledge of the airport.
The captain can be faulted for excessively trusting the first officer. The first officer clearly contributed by claiming expertise that he did not have.
How'd we end up with two guys in the cockpit who don't know the way around?
Investigators now wonder why neither pilot knew the layout of Detroit's airport, a major hub for Northwest Airlines, the company where they both worked.
Our DC-9 crew was really not familiar with the Detroit airport. And then you bring in all the other things like low visibility, it all comes together to create a dangerous situation.
Investigators try to understand why neither of the pilots of Flight 1482 knew the layout of Detroit Airport. Are there gaps in their training or experience that could account for it? They study the personnel files of the DC-9's crew.
Medical leave. The captain has been on medical leave for 6 years.
6?
Yeah. He just started back to work.
In fact, Flight 1482 was his first unsupervised flight since resuming his duties.
He was very grateful to get back to work. He knew he had catching up to do because the procedures had changed, modernized.
Investigators then look into First Officer Schiffin's background. They discover he was an ex-military pilot who had joined Northwest earlier that year.
The first officer had an Air Force background, B-52s and T-38 Talons, and quite an extensive experience.
He also was an experienced pilot, except not in the DC-9. He only had a few hundred hours at most in the right seat of a DC-9.
Both pilots had tons of experience, but they were both new recruits to Northwest.
That doesn't explain how they got lost on a routine taxi.
The pilot's experience alone doesn't provide enough clues to determine what went wrong during a routine taxi. Investigators need to look elsewhere.
It was paramount for us to try to figure out exactly where the DC-9 was, almost to the second, during the whole sequence of events here. We had some help from the tower, not a lot, because they couldn't see what was going on.
By listening to the cockpit voice recording, investigators hope they will be able to figure out where the DC-9 went astray.
All ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's begin.
I haven't even got a uniform yet.
Even before 1482 pushes back from the gate, investigators hear a conversation that gets their attention.
Not even a jacket.
Captain Lovelace had returned to flying so recently, he hadn't yet received the Northwest uniform.
Nah, only got my old company's jacket.
The cockpit voice recorder recorded the last half hour of voices in the cockpit. So we got to know a little bit more about the crew members in a more casual setting before they really started taxiing.
One thing I miss, I've always flown with an ejection seat. I've used it twice.
As the pilots waited, the first officer began to boast about his military service.
Yeah, I bet that was scary when you punched out.
I got shot down once over Southeast Asia, and I didn't have time to get scared.
Oh, is that right?
And then when I was flying T-38s one time, I had an engine fire. Tower controller said, "You were on fire, eject." Bam! Wow.
Wow.
At that time in the NTSB, a lot of us had military backgrounds. He and I were in the same place at nearly the same time, so my ears perked up.
How long were you in the service?
20 years. Retired as a lieutenant colonel.
Okay, you can stop it there. Is he some kind of war hero?
Sounds like it.
Let's look at his military record. Check out his story.
To bail out or eject out of 2 different airplanes, that's very rare. So it started to make me look a little askance at what's going on.
Investigators wonder if the first officer was being honest about his military record. They study his military discharge form.
Check this out. He's clearly embellishing.
It turns out that He didn't bail out of any aircraft at any time.
He said that he retired as a lieutenant colonel. Well, in fact, he retired as a major.
We even have a phrase for that, stolen valor. It kind of set things on edge a little bit for us.
Why would he lie?
That's a good question.
Benson rechecks the first officer's file for any clue.
Why would somebody give themselves a higher status than they were really entitled to? Why would they brag about things that didn't happen to them?
He was still on probation.
So he needed the captain to give him a good report.
I think the first officer was bragging to impress the captain, because first officer was still in his probation stage, and a bad mark would be tantamount to not getting a career with Northwest Airlines.
The boasting is not normal for a professional commercial pilot, but it doesn't explain the cause of the crash.
Let's continue.
After sitting at the gate for 40 minutes, the DC-9 gets the call to taxi.
Northwest 1482, right turn out of parking, taxi to runway 3 center, exit ramp at Oscar 6.
Okay, let's see where they go. And let's confirm any directional changes with the FDR data.
Investigators combine the cockpit voice recording with the heading changes from the flight data recorder from Northwest Flight 1482 to better understand the plane's every movement on the ground.
Every time the compass swung, we could see the aircraft turning almost in our minds. He had to be on this taxiway if it's this heading, had to be on this taxiway if it's another heading, so it worked out well.
3 center, exit the ramp at Oscar 6. Did you get all that?
Yeah, but I'm going to need you to have it.
Kind of wind around here, and Oscar 6 is going to be right around the corner here.
Okay.
Just kind of stay on the ramp here.
Okay, Jim, you just watch, make sure I go the right way.
Okay.
Investigators discover that as they began to taxi, Captain Lovelace asked his first officer to navigate.
The first officer was correct in offering up help to the captain, and the captain was correct in accepting the help. I mean, this is just the way things should work. This didn't surprise us.
Left turn or right turn?
Yeah, well, this is the inner taxiway here. We're still going for Oscar 6.
So, left turn?
Yeah.
So, when they should go straight through Oscar 6, they turn off it and go east.
Seems like the first officer is calling the shots.
Just keep going straight.
Okay.
It was a gradual thing at first. First officer was kind of taking on a bit more responsibility, a bit more, and then he started to direct the taxi itself.
We're headed eastbound on Oscar 6 here.
Just as the controller said, you can't go east on Oscar 6. Oscar 6 runs north-south.
Northwest 1482, you were on the outer taxiway.
Yeah, that's right.
The investigators next hear the course correction that was supposed to get Flight 1482 back on track.
Northwest
1482 at Oscar 4. Take the right turn on X-ray. Report
crossing 927.
Roger. At Oscar 4, make the right turn onto X-ray.
The DC-9 crew was definitely told to continue eastbound and make a hard right turn onto X-ray to get back on track.
So what do we do here?
You make the right turn, report crossing 27.
The captain is now relying completely on his first officer.
Once you break down the dialogue between the captain and the first officer and the DC-9, it becomes very obvious that this role reversal was pretty total. By the time the accident occurred, the reversal was complete.
There's Oscar 4. This is X-ray.
The first officer was pulling him around by the nose, so to speak, and the captain was simply going along. As a personal note, I liked the captain very much. He was a very sweet and gentle person, but that was sort of his undoing, the fact that he did not exercise his authority in any forceful way.
Let's hold there.
But did that passiveness cause them to miss the crucial right turn?
Okay, so the last instruction was that Oscar 4 turn right onto X-ray.
Northwest 1482, cross 927.
This should be 927.
You sure?
Well, that's what he said. Yeah.
Yeah, this is 927.
In the fog, the crew is still struggling to follow the controller's directions to get back to the runway.
Right over here, then.
Yeah, that way. I think we're on X-ray here now.
There is no way they're on X-ray.
They never make it onto X-ray.
The investigators learned the DC-9 crew wasn't able to navigate the critical right turn onto X-ray.
That turn onto X-ray was quite a difficult turn. It was not a 90 or 70 degree turn that pilots are used to. It was about 120 degrees.
What runway is this? Turn left over there. No, wait, that's a runway 2.
They are totally disoriented.
Tell them we're out here, we're stuck.
Somehow, they've made it here.
And we've got two planes facing each other on the same runway. But there's signs and surface markings all along here. I don't get it.
When an aircraft gets lost on the airfield, usually the pilots will spot signs or something like that, help clarify the position in the controller's mind of where the aircraft is exactly.
Investigators are baffled. Why didn't the airport's signage and runway marks prevent the pilots from losing their way?
This is a runway.
To better understand why the crew of a DC-9 couldn't follow the signage at Detroit Metropolitan Airport,
let's do this.
Investigators retrace their route.
The only way to fix this in our minds was to perform what we call a taxi demonstration. We get in a DC-9, taxi around the same route that the accident aircraft taxied down.
Wow. Will you look at that?
At the Oscar 6 intersection, where Flight 1482 made the initial wrong turn, Rodriguez finds something disturbing. They discover that the yellow taxi center line the DC-9 was supposed to follow is badly faded.
We noted things like painted markings on the taxiways that were worn in places.
I could barely see it on a bright day.
It was obvious that if we got confused in broad daylight with no fog, perfect visibility, that the issue was more acute when you could barely see your hand in front of your face out there.
Now investigators make their way to the Oscar 4 intersection, where the DC-9 crew failed to make that critical right turn.
So which way is the Oscar 4 sign pointing? Right or straight ahead?
Rodriguez discovers the signage at the intersection is deficient.
It was amazing, the problems with the signage when you get to Oscar 4. It's just a very wide mass of concrete with no lighting and no indications of where they are.
Now we're supposed to turn right on X-ray. But it's actually back there.
The investigators find that if the plane actually reaches the Oscar 4 intersection, they've already missed the right turn to get onto X-ray.
And the only right turn here gets you onto the active runway.
The team determines the signage on Oscar 4 contributed to the DC-9 crew getting lost. Instead of turning right on X-ray, the crew passed X-ray and turned up the active runway instead.
We're out here, we're stuck.
We can't see anything.
But I believe we're on a runway.
Okay, are you on the taxiway or the runway?
Ground, it looks like we're on 21 center here.
Northwest 1482, you say you're on 21 center?
I believe we are. We're not sure.
Yes, we are.
Northwest 1482, exit that runway immediately, sir.
When you have multiple intersecting runways, the only way for pilots to really be certain of where they are is to have unmistakable signs that offer pilots clear and readily interpretable information, and that's what was missing in this accident.
But there's still an unanswered question about the tragedy.
Northwest 1482, exit that runway immediately, sir.
Once Flight 1482 reported being on the runway, why didn't air traffic control stop the other plane from taking off?
They should have been able to stop that aircraft and avoid a collision.
Oh, damn! Auto cut!
To understand what happened just before the crash,
Yes, absolutely no question about that.
investigators interview the tower controller responsible for clearing the 727 for takeoff.
We found out there was a plane on the runway.
The DC-9's crew informed the ground controller, sitting next to the tower controller, that they were lost on the runway.
Northwest 1482, exit that runway immediately, sir. I've got a lost aircraft out here. It may be on the runway. Okay, all aircraft on this frequency, just stop. Stop your taxi right now, please.
Investigators learned the ground controller stopped all taxiing traffic around the airport. But the 727 had already switched to a different radio frequency and didn't hear that instruction. The tower controller never issued his own warning to the crew.
The tower's controller had a decision to make and decided to not do anything, not say anything to the aircraft.
Investigators now question the tower controller about why he didn't warn the 727 that there was a DC-9 lost on the runway ahead of them.
I thought they were already airborne.
The controller said nothing because he figured that the 727 had already taken off and was airborne.
Because it had been a full minute since he cleared the 727, the tower controller thought the plane had taken off. But the 727 was still at the runway threshold.
I think they would have been able to stop that aircraft, or at least eased over to the left side of the runway as they continued to roll out and aborted takeoff.
Now investigators need to know why it took the 727 so long to begin its takeoff.
Let's hear it.
They listen to the plane's cockpit voice recorder to determine what happened just before the plane began its takeoff roll.
Cleared for takeoff, runway 3 center, 299.
They learned that shortly after getting permission to take off,
Final items. Anti-skid.
On.
the crew of the 727 delayed takeoff to perform a final checklist.
Takeoff check complete.
With thick fog obscuring the runway, the tower controller did not know they had not yet taken off. But was the checklist the only factor that affected the plane's takeoff?
It's definitely not a quarter mile.
Investigators also discovered that the pilots noticed the fog was getting worse.
They knew that they needed 1/4 of a mile of visibility, forward visibility, before they could take off. But when they got to the end of the runway, it became very, very iffy whether they had that type of visibility.
But nonetheless, they went ahead and took off.
Investigators finally think they know what happened on the day of the collision.
Now, what runway is this? This is a runway.
Yeah. Turn left over there. No, wait, that's runway 2.
A dysfunctional and disoriented DC-9 crew mistakenly taxied onto an active runway.
Knots.
A 727 crew took off in visibility it knew was below minimums.
I've got a lost aircraft out here. It may be on the runway. Okay, all aircraft on this frequency just stop. Stop your taxi right now, please.
And a tower controller failed to warn the 727 crew about the lost plane on the runway because he thought the 727 was already airborne.
Oh, no.
Oh, damn!
It took all of these things in sequence for this accident to happen, and that's one of the things that makes it unusual, not just the number of errors, but their uniqueness and what it says about human interactions. That is really remarkable.
God, oh God!
In the end, almost everybody involved in this accident did something wrong. There really just are no heroes in this one.
And flying was my life.
Captain Bill Lovelace never worked as an airline pilot again. Neither did First Officer Jim Shiffens. He became a first responder and firefighter. In the aftermath of the crash, Detroit Metropolitan Airport improved signage and now uses highly visible reflective paint for all airfield markings. All U.S. airports are required to use the same signage to avoid confusion. The confusing Oscar 4 intersection was rebuilt. Dozens of U.S. airports have installed new technologies that allow controllers to monitor taxiing aircraft.
Ground radar with audible and oral warnings as well to tell controllers of an impending collision is in place at most major airports at this point in time. That's gone a long ways to preventing actual collisions from happening.